Hi, everybody. Welcome to Odd Week Sunday School at St. Andrew's Covenant Presbyterian Church. Our lesson today comes from the first gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. Picks up a little bit where we left off last week, since there's 2 odd weeks in a row. Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. This is a text about teachers and hypocrites, and especially hypocritical teachers. So it's probably a text that a teacher should handle with a 10-foot pole, but let's give it a try. We're here at the end of Matthew's gospel after Jesus has entered Jerusalem in triumph as the one who comes in the name of the Lord. But the tension here between Jesus and other teachers of the word, especially a group called the Pharisees, the leading group, comes to sort of a fever pitch. So last week we talked about chapter 22, in which the Pharisees and others gave Jesus some trick questions, and Jesus responded with a pretty tricky question of his own. But here in chapter 23, Jesus does all the talking, and I sort of imagine that I hear his voice getting louder and louder as he goes through this harangue, really, aimed at people that he calls hypocrites. And when Jesus calls somebody a hypocrite, it's not really a compliment. So let's read the text from Matthew 23, verses 1 to 12. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, and all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." And it continues in that vein, and it gets even a little bit hotter in temperature as you go through the rest of chapter 23. So coming so close to the end of his ministry, we have to assume that these words that Jesus spoke were very, very important to him, ideas that he really wanted to convey to those that were listening. So what is so bad about being a bad teacher? You know, Matthew is kind of a teacher's manual of sorts, and Jesus in this gospel is portrayed as a teacher, and his teaching techniques are often on full display. In fact, that last verse of Matthew, it's a very famous one that many of you have probably memorized, the Great Commission from chapter 28. The last line goes like this: "And teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." So in case we haven't noticed this before, the Great Commandment, the Great Commission, is really a commission to teach. So if the mission is teaching obedience to the commands of Jesus, that puts chapter 23, the showdown here between influential teachers, influential but hypocritical teachers, and Jesus in sharp focus. Don't be this kind of teacher, Jesus is saying. You know, and to whom is Jesus addressing this Education 101 lecture? Apparently to everybody that's within earshot, because these showdowns between Jesus and the Pharisees are always in public, and Jesus even says here it's directed to the crowds and his disciples, so both groups of people he is speaking to. All right, so I want to make 4 observations this time, something different, 4. First, The first thing Jesus does in this passage is approve of the Pharisees. He offers some very impressive approval of a group of people that he's about to criticize. He says, they sit in Moses' seat. There may actually have been such a seat in the temple, as interpreters of the Word of God. And they must be good at it because Jesus tells the people that are listening, do what they tell you. They really know the law. I think this kind of reminds us that, we need to be careful where we put ourselves in this scene. Where are we standing when Jesus is scolding the Pharisees? I'm pretty sure the point is that if we see ourselves standing with Jesus, pointing a finger at the Pharisees, that we're getting it wrong. I think we need to reblock this scene, and we're standing over here in the throng of the Pharisees. He's talking to us. The Pharisees are so important in Matthew's gospel, I think, because they were pretty close to getting it right. And because they were close to getting it right, they studied the Word. They taught it pretty well. They always wanted to be thinking and talking about God. They were God people. And therefore, people who were hungry for God paid a lot of attention to them. They were actually important preparers of the way. Paul was a Pharisee. And in the near future, these faith leaders were going to be the people who would help the Jews remain true to the Word and true to their faith after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So they were the church leaders, the faith leaders of their day. And they did command people's respect. And that's why Jesus worked on them so hard. And the question is, do we see ourselves in these people? People who claim to be guided by God bear a very heavy responsibility because other people are watching them. Other people look to them, skeptical people. And if Jesus can get our attention here, he's offering to help us with this responsibility. But of course, here in chapter 23, it's mainly a negative lesson that Jesus is teaching. It's mostly about what we should not be like. Right after Jesus says, listen to what they say, he says, but for heaven's sake, don't do what they do, because they don't do what they say. Here, I just have to remember my father, who was a very wise man, and when he wanted to head off our teenage claims to inconsistency right at the pass, he would always say to my sister and me, do as I say, not as I do. He just admitted it. There was a lot of self-knowledge in that statement. But when I think about an honest teacher, the story I remember the most is of a young colleague of mine at UNCW. And one year she was assigned to teach the historical research methods class for history majors. And this was a class where we tried to impart all the finest advice and rules about how one really goes about doing historical research and how one arrives at conclusions and writes a big paper. People mostly didn't like to take this class, and people also mostly didn't like to teach it. And that might have been because there was a fair amount of hypocrisy in the class. Do it like this. This is how to do it. Of course, we don't really do it that way ourselves. Well, she decided, this great teacher that I'm thinking of, the semester she taught it, that she would write an article from scratch, a new research project she would undertake, and she would follow all the rules. She would do everything the way that she was teaching her students to do it. And she became their partner then. They were able to talk over what seemed to work, what seemed not to work. This was really teaching at its best. It was inspirational. So anyway, the not so subtle point here is that knowing the law, knowing the Word of God, is an absolute prerequisite for teaching it. You have to know it. But actually doing it, actually following it yourself, is a much more effective way to teach it than just telling someone to do it. And it probably takes fewer words. The second thing that Jesus mentions that he has against the Pharisees in this passage is in verse 4. He says, they tie up heavy loads and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift up a finger to move them. What would it look like to lift a finger to help move a burden that was on somebody else's shoulders? Can we think about a situation where we expect someone to live up to a high standard of behavior, but we don't really give them very much help to do it? We know what's good for somebody, or even what's right, but we just leave it to them to dig up the courage and the energy to do it all by themselves. Or worse, sometimes maybe we actually put a barrier in the way of their doing it. So the point is that if it's really our hope that people will live the word and do what the law says to do, then maybe we should build a world where it's easier for people to succeed at that. And maybe even easier for us to succeed. You know, did you ever have one of those moments as a parent where you were telling a child, you know, if you would go to bed now and get a good night's sleep, you'd feel much better tomorrow? And the little voice in the back of your head is saying, you know, if you would go to bed now and get a good night's sleep, you would feel better tomorrow. And then did you go to bed? The third point about bad teaching is that it's mostly for showing off to other people. In verse 5, Jesus shifts to talking about what these Pharisees are actually doing. And here, even though they are wearing God's commandments on their persons, that's what the phylacteries are, and they're obeying the rules about fringe on their garments and lots of other rules that they're following, they're doing it for the wrong reason. They don't have the right spirit about what they're doing. Jesus says everything they do is for others to see. So maybe the big problem with seeking places of honor and titles of honor is that these teachers have entirely forgotten their students. What do the people see when they look at these teachers showing off and elbowing their way up to the front? This chapter 23 echoes a lot of lines that are earlier in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, back in chapter 6, Jesus says things like this: "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before others to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by men. They have received their reward in full. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full." So the point is, if the reason why we obey the Word of God is to show off and impress people about our piety, our reward for that will be, well, people will see us and they'll think something. But the reward won't be that we have helped people move any closer to God. In fact, Jesus goes on to say, don't even call yourself a teacher. Don't call yourself a rabbi, much less father. Just be brothers and sisters, be partners, and learn together and help each other do the right thing. Finally, I think we get a little extra insight about the dangers of hypocritical teaching from Paul, a figure who soon emerges, a Pharisee who becomes a Christ follower. When Paul's engaged in this long-running argument with other Christian leaders about whether or not the Gentile converts to Christianity need to become pious Jews and follow Jewish regulations first. It was Paul's position that they did not. The Gentile converts who became followers of Jesus, for example, did not need to practice circumcision, which the Jews did. Of course, that's a rather daunting prospect for grown men. In Galatians 6, Paul says, "Not even those who are circumcised obey the law, yet they want you to be circumcised, that they may boast about your flesh." So is Paul saying here that the Pharisees, or the Christians who are behaving like Pharisees, are testing you to make themselves look good? If they get you to do something hard, it'll make them look like brilliant teachers. Likewise, in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, when Paul is going on with others about the same point, he says this: "Why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear?" Now, there's an interesting idea. How are the Pharisees testing God? How are we testing God when we expect other people to do what even we are not actually able to do? Are we daring him to make a public display of punishing the people that we think deserve to be punished? Have you ever noticed how many times that doesn't happen? Could it be we're wrong about who needs to be punished? Or maybe we're just dealing with a merciful God, and maybe that's good for us. I think for me, this speech for Jesus really hits home in Matthew 23 because he's addressing it to God people. And the speech goes on and on after this passage. It's really a very long teaching, a very loud harangue, so close to the end of his ministry, so obviously important to him. Some people are God people, and some people are not. I mean, to me, that's the greatest mystery of all. But what's the main obligation of those who are God followers? Isn't it to point other people toward God? And as a wise minister once said to me when I asked her, what's so bad about hypocrisy that Jesus talks about it all the time? She said, the point is that hypocrisy not only does not point people toward God, it actually points them in the other direction. Okay, that's our lesson for this week, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks on the next Odd Week Sunday School. Be well.